What's going on? What's going on? It's the Tamale Mafia podcast, the place where everything and nothing collide. And it's just another Monday in the Tamale Mafia universe. I'm your host, Aaron. I have a very, very, very special episode for you today, because I sit down with a very, very good buddy of mine. One of my longest friends, best friends. We've been friends since we were little bitty kids. And this is the kind of friend that always challenges me to think beyond my current scope. You know, when I'm thinking through things, he has the ability to push me beyond the edge of my own personal capacity, so to speak. Because I'm kind of an idiot sometimes, and it's good to have somebody to like push you to think beyond idiot realm. But anyway, we'll get more into that here in the conversation. But I just wanted to welcome you guys to the show and let you know we're going to have this conversation basically about masculinity and what it means in today's society and how it applies to our lives. It's a really good conversation. It's a conversation packed with all kinds of opinion, and I mean, neither of us are experts, but these are the things that we think about and we question, and we're trying to navigate and help each other navigate in our lives. So I thought we would let you in on a little bit of that, and hopefully you learn something or feel inspired by it along the way. If you have thoughts or comments, you can always join the conversation. Facebook.com/Tamale Mafia. All right, guys. So having said that, let's get into this week's episode as I sit down with my good friend, longtime buddy, Joseph Brewster, and explore what it means to be masculine in today's society. I have a very special guest with us today because I think every person should have somebody in your life who is a lot smarter than you are, and who studies more than you do and reads more than you do, so that they can ask you the tough questions that you don't think of yourself.
And Aaron's still on a quest to find that person, but until then...
Yeah, until that point. No, that guy for me has been for years, has been Joseph Brewster, and he's with us today. I'm super excited. I've been wanting to get you on a podcast for a while because we have had epic conversations from the time we were children. I mean, we've been friends since we were 4 years old, 4 and 5, something like that.
Yeah.
A long, long time. We're much older than that now. So,
little.
Majority of our lives, we've been a part of each other's lives. And so... I think earliest I can remember was probably before you went to college, I think, when we were in that like middle teenage to older teenage years.
Yeah.
I think that's where we really started, like sitting out in your front yard, looking up at the stars and trying to break down the universe.
Well, we did have some debates about whether or not the Dark Knight was a satanic figure at some point.
Oh, that's right.
In front of a conservative Baptist church in Greenville, Texas.
That's right. And when that came out in 89?
Yeah,
The Dark Knight?
It was around when Tim Burton was rebooting the series, and Batman was no longer pow, smack, and bright blue, and then conservative Christians were concerned that he was a representation of demonic powers.
Yes, because of his first of all, his elongated bat ears.
Yeah, and all black.
And being dressed in all black. And associated with darkness and night.
Yeah. Yeah, which he probably is. Batman as a character is probably, the Satanist's attempt to infiltrate America and convert everyone to the occult. However, they haven't convinced me yet. So
No. Well, they had me convinced back in 89 or 90. I mean, because I remember you walked up with a Batman action figure. And, I mean, to be clear, back then, you had all the action figures that the rest of us weren't allowed to play with.
Really? Because
Yeah.
I always felt like I was restricted. I remember I could never play with any He-Man toys and, Cabbage Patch Kids or anything like that. They were all associated with occultic practices for one reason or another.
Yeah, well, it was because that book came out.
Something in the toy box.
Yeah.
Satan in the toy box.
Something like that, yeah. I looked up that book recently, or actually it was probably a year ago, just to kind of refresh myself. And I hated it. Even just looking at the cover made me angry. But yeah, that book came out in that like video series and all the stuff that we were doing at the church. I remember being a kid and it was like, well, I mean, if you thought you were restricted, I wasn't allowed to own the toys that you had. So,
Yeah.
we were doubly restricted in that regard because you had Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle action figures and I wasn't allowed to play with those guys.
I think because some of them were smiling, I got away with it more. They seemed more innocuous than, I don't know, dark clothes. Anything with magic, that was off limits. And Ninja Turtles, they weren't really magic. They were, pollution created them, and then they used real weapons. But when you get into things like Power Rangers or He-Man or anything like that, these people were channeling some sort of force that probably wasn't officially condoned by Jesus, and so I couldn't touch any of those.
Yeah. Did you have Star Wars?
No, but I think it was more because I just didn't know anything about it. I wasn't allowed to watch those movies or go to theaters, so I just didn't know anything about Star Wars. I remember at one point getting you remember record books where they give you like these little booklets, and in the back they'd have a 45, like a little record, and you could take it out of the sleeve and you could play it.
Yeah.
So I got that. It was like an audio version of A New Hope, the first episode of the second, episode 4.
Episode 4, yeah.
Yeah. And my brother reading me the book and we listening to the little 45 record, but I didn't even know they were selling toys at the time. I don't remember seeing those in the store. I'm old.
Yeah, well, I think... Yeah, I don't remember toys either, but I know they existed because I've seen them now, throwbacks, But I think that the big thing for us was always G.I. Joes because those guys were like the toy to have. And I remember I wanted Snake Eyes so bad. That's like all I wanted was Snake Eyes, and my mom was like, "No, you can't have Snake Eyes because one, snake, that's
right.
Satan, that's a representation of evil.
Garden of Eden, yeah.
All dressed in black. That's another representation of evil.
It's Storm Shadow. He was all dressed in white. He was the good version of Snake Eyes.
But Snake Eyes was a good guy.
Right. Well.
And I couldn't have gotten Storm Shadow because he was Cobra. And I couldn't own any Cobra because the snake, Cobra. So I could only have G.I. Joes, but I couldn't have Snake Eyes, and I was so mad. I remember, when I think I was married already, and I was like, you know what? God dang it, I'm going to buy freaking Snake Eyes. And I went and bought a Snake Eyes toy.
I bought a Snake Eyes toy since I was married, yes, just for the nostalgia of it. I had it on my desk for a while when I was in the ministry. I had a Snake Eyes figurine. Yeah,
I bought when they did the reissue, the 12-inch figures, I bought this Snake Eyes ninja guy, He had, swords, and he had the whole thing. He was super cool.
Compensating for something from your childhood?
Yeah,
I'm
definitely.
going to have to buy the 12-inch figure because I never got him growing up.
Yeah. Well, my kids, when I had kids, they destroyed him. He had, kung fu grip and everything. His hands were missing, so he was doing, he had, this, just the devil horns because the rest of his fingers were missing.
Yeah, I don't remember too many intelligent conversations from our childhood other than the Batman one. It wasn't until we got into high school, I think, that we...
Oh, yeah, we rabbit trailed in.
Yeah.
I was how did we get on this? Yeah, that's right. Yeah, once we got into high school, and then we would, I remember just sitting out in your front yard and trying to break down the universe, figure out how we got here and where we're headed. And back then, we were still, I think we were still both on the same plane of like where we stood with our faith and our religion and stuff. And so we had a different scope back then in our conversations than we do now. We both come a long way and have ventured away from our childhood teachings and kind of the things that we were involved in the past, and then try to find some kind of like stable foundation to land on. So now when we break down the universe, it's a whole different conversation. But we were having a conversation recently, and I think it was kind of because of one of my previous podcast episodes, episode 15, and I was talking about this like recent struggle with craving masculinity and trying to figure out like what it means to be a man, and how I feel like a boy sometimes in my head. And we started having a conversation via text message, and I was like, "Oh, this is good stuff. I need to save this because we need to do a podcast on this," because you brought up some interesting points in that conversation. And one of the questions that you asked me via text was like, "How do you manifest this in real life? Like, what does it mean to be masculine?" You know. And I didn't know how to answer the question, and I thought about it because initially I started writing, like working with tools, you know, just trying to like the physical manifestation of being a masculine man. And so I was like, obviously working with tools, working with my hands, you know, if I knew how to take apart an engine, I'd probably feel pretty manly. But then the more I thought about it, I was like, well, that doesn't really capture it because, well, one, there's a lot of females and feminine, even like non-masculine, you could say males that are into that kind of stuff too. So it's like, well, it's not like a single, if you do this, then this kind of thing. You know, it's not that mathematical equation. So I was like, the more I thought about it, I was like, I don't know how do you manifest it. And I thought, well, maybe it's more like a feeling because, like I was saying, I feel sometimes like I'm still a kid in my head, and it's hard for me to believe, oh my God, I'm actually almost 40, you know, and I don't think of myself as being almost 40. And I remember when I was a kid looking at my dad, and when my dad was almost 40, he was like, everything, by all means, you would consider him a grown-ass man. But did he feel the way I feel? And I've never asked him.
And he did a lot of things in his lifetime that would be considered manly things. He was in the military. He wouldn't have been considered a wimp or... No,
not at all. I mean, he was a tough guy for sure. I mean, he's still
hard
around,
worker.
But hard worker. Worked with his hands in the fields and stuff. I mean, he was. As he got older, he got into engineering and stuff, and was in an office. But yeah, tough guy, military, Marine Corps, like hardcore. So I always looked at my dad. I never questioned, is my dad a man? You know, and I think if you had told my dad he wasn't a man, he probably would have punched him. You know, he probably would have hit that guy, whoever said that.
Well, when you think about that, the question that comes to mind is, in what scenarios can you imagine someone accusing another person of not being much of a man? You know, sometimes in popular culture, you'll hear that in a movie or something. You'll hear an accusation coming from a partner or a wife, or, you know, you're just not being a man right now. In what case do you hear that being used, and what does that mean to you when you hear that being said?
Well, interestingly, not too long ago, several months ago, my dad and I were at a neighbor's, like one of my dad's friends' properties, and we were helping him load up some stuff in his truck, and he's talking. This guy is like this guy that just rambles on. He just talks. He's got 1,000 things he's saying at once, and he got to talking about how he had hired this guy to help him do some work around the place, around his property, and the guy was worthless. The guy didn't know how to do anything. And so this guy, my dad's friend, was like, what kind of man doesn't know how to take apart an engine and put it back together? I could take apart an engine and rebuild an engine when I was 12 years old. My daddy taught me that. And if what kind of man wouldn't know how to do that? And he's just going on like that's a worthless father that wouldn't teach his son how to take apart an engine when by the time he's 12 years old. And this guy's just old man, just rambling on. And my dad is like looking at me, and later when we were recalling, like kind of laughing through the conversation, my dad was like, God, I guess I'm not worth a shit, man. I mean, I didn't teach you anything about taking apart engines. And it was kind of an interesting, so when you mentioned that, it's like that kind of stuck out to me, like to this guy, working with your hands, being able to work with tools and stuff, that's what makes you a man. So you're not a man if you don't know how to do this. And it was the first time ever that I saw my dad kind of like reel backwards, like, oh, I didn't teach my son how to do that, so does that mean I'm not a man,
Yeah.
And, I mean, I would not have held that against my dad. I don't hold that against my dad now, that he didn't teach me certain things. Maybe he didn't know certain things to teach, but...
Well, maybe if you were taking apart and putting together engines, it would complete your sense of masculinity, and then that's the missing link. I doubt it, but...
Well, I mean, it is one of the things that I first started to type whenever you asked me that question. I first started to type, working with my hands, being able to work with tools. And I was like, maybe that's not it, same thing. But, like, there was a guy on Instagram that I follow, and this guy was in the military, veteran. He's a super tough guy. But he recently started some kind of little company where he's building things out of wood. And he posted on his Instagram this past week, I didn't have a dad growing up, and, I've always struggled with masculinity. And I'm going, this guy too. He goes, and I'm finally, for the first time in my life, know what it feels like to be a man who works with his hands. And I was like, wow. So it sits in that guy's psyche too. And this guy's a tough dude. Mm-hmm. He's been on TV for being a tough dude. You know what I mean? And so he posted that on Instagram, and I was like, wow. If you're finding any part of this conversation even just a little bit interesting or exciting, please head on over to our Facebook page, join the conversation there, like it, share the link, comment if you can, if you have anything to say. We'd love to hear from you. So anyway, thanks for listening, and let's get back to our conversation.
Well, I think there comes a time where legally we transition from being an adolescent or a dependent to being an adult. But I don't know that transition psychologically or physically, I think there might be a stage at which you'd say that transition is complete. But psychologically, I think we're always in a state of oscillation. So we never leave behind the child. And we never fully convert to only being the adult. We have moments of going back and forth. Our body doesn't go back to being adolescent again. And our legal status never allows us to get discounts at the restaurants again, like we could when we were 6. But there are moments where we distinctly feel psychologically like we're 6 again. And these insecurities and this uncertainty comes crashing down on us. And, we wish that we just had a parent there who would fix everything and we didn't have to make these decisions. I think that's something that throughout our life, I don't want to say there's a tension between the adult and the child. I think sometimes there is, but I think what I would like to say there is a sort of harmony or a complementary existence between this childlike part of you and the adult part of you. so that no matter where you get, I think you'll be 70s, 80s, and still struggling with the concept of how grown up am I acting, really? You know, when I assess my fears and my insecurities and my accomplishments in life and my relationship statuses, you know, how much do I feel like I can say that I'm a man? I don't know that we'll ever, any of us, get to the point where we don't have to ask that question again.
Yeah, but what is it about us that makes us ask that question? Why can't we just be... Where does that come from? The need to say, "Oh, I don't feel grown. I don't feel like a man." I like, not like an awareness, but actually like a deficiency where you feel like I am not living up to what I need to be. I'm not where I need to be. Like, what is it that drives that? Is it a societal thing? Is there some kind of like thing that's training us or like programming into us from an early age that this is what you need to become, and if you don't get there, but what is that thing? You know, it's like, why do we ask that question?
Oh, I think absolutely. I don't think you can separate individuals from the society that they've grown up in and the way that their culture has been programmed. I don't know that there's any way to say how much of this is the society and how much of it's just coming from you. I think those are so strongly integrated, it's hard to tell the difference. But what do we mean when we say man? I've used this term before. I've talked to my son who's 15. I've said, probably this week, I think, I made a statement to him where I said, I need you to act like a man. And what I meant in that context was he was struggling to be authentic about an experience that had happened, and he was feeling insecure and embarrassed about it, and he had gone to some lengths to try not to address it. And what I meant in that moment wasn't that I needed him to do something which was unique to masculinity. What I meant was I needed him to do something that was unique to adulthood. And had I been talking with my daughter at the same age about the same experience, I might have said, I need you to be a woman about this. So what I meant by that is I need you to move from the place of being a child who's insecure and afraid to a place of being an adult who's willing to take responsibility and who's learning to be self-sufficient, if that makes sense. So I think when I think of the difference between someone who is manly and someone who is not, I don't think of activities. I don't think of hunting or fishing or anything like that, because I live in the inner city. I don't live anywhere where you can go hunt and fish. You'd have to go a long ways. Most of the men that I know work in development and programming and computer-related jobs. Is that manly? I'm imagining the scenario you brought with the engine, and I'm thinking, extrapolate that 50 years in the future in a conversation being something like, you never taught your son how to write HTML code? Like, what kind of guy doesn't teach his son how to write? Everybody knows how to make their own websites, and they can take them apart and put them back together. Is that going to be the definition of manly? And I think if that's what we're going to use, it's constantly going to shift with the culture. And maybe that's okay to a certain extent, but there's a certain egalitarian part of my thinking that wants to say that shouldn't be something we exclude a gender from. If you want to take apart and put together engines, do it. I don't really care what your gender is. If you want to code, if you want to go hunt, if you want to wear camo, do it. I don't care if you're a girl or a boy. But we don't want to put the gun in the hands of a child. And if we do, that they need to be supervised. We want to trust a weapon in the hands of an adult because we believe that person can make wise decisions. And to me, that's sort of the difference between a child and a man, or on the other spectrum, a child and a woman, is that you were a girl, so we understand, you went through these things, but now you're becoming a woman, so we need you to own your identity. We need you to be authentic. We need you to be responsible and to, communicate in social settings in such a way that you own who you are. Because we expect that as a child, you don't know who you are. When you say as a child, I want to be a fireman or I want to be an astronaut, we smile internally knowing that you probably won't do that. That's sweet, right? but these are evolving ideas, and your parent might say, well, next year you're going to want to do something else. But as we grow up and we become an adult, I think there comes a time where we're faced with an identity where we can either embrace it and say, this is me, or we can deny it. We can be ashamed of it. And I think when we deny it and we act ashamed of it, it places us in very childlike responses, if that makes sense. We react immaturely about who we are and in relation to our society, how we interact. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying. I think that line is when you're talking about maturity, basically, right? When you tell your son, I need you to be a man about this, you're talking about a maturity level.
Yeah.
Rather than strictly masculinity.
But what is, in your mind, what is the difference between, masculinity and maturity? I mean, obviously they're different terms. Masculinity is specifically applying to grown-up males, but inherent in the term masculinity is maturity. So what do you think is the relationship there between those two terms?
That's a good question, and I think one of the things that I was thinking about while you were talking, I was kind of listening to you and trying to decide what is that difference, because I think maturity is almost a different topic, right? Maturity and masculinity, it's almost two different things, and yet they're still kind of related, obviously. So I don't know. It's difficult because I feel like there's still something inside of me that says I don't have enough of this. And when I think back on my childhood and the fact that I was raised mostly by my grandmother and my mother, because my dad was always working, he was always out of town, he was always he was there, but he just was always working. So I didn't have a lot of one-on-one time with him. And the times that I did have with him, I tried to soak up as much as I could and wanted him to treat me like I was one of his, morons in the Marine Corps and make me do push-ups. And, I wanted to kind of have him man over me, you know what I mean? And teach me, be tough, and kind of like be strong with me. Because I felt there was a craving for that kind of interaction that I didn't have with my mom and my grandmother, I mean, my mom and grandma were teaching me how to sew and how to knit, and which was fine to learn as skills, but it didn't satisfy the craving in me to like want to hit something, and so I think, I don't know, man. I think there's, I don't know what you think of this, but recently I've been listening to some other podcasts and other people talk kind of about our ancestry and our DNA and like our primal roots and this kind of stuff. And there's a group of people that believe that our ancestors are basically written into our DNA. So if you have this long line of humans in your past, there's a little piece of them that passes all the way through the line to you to kind of write the code that makes you you. And so if you had some like warriors in your past, you have a kind of a bend towards wanting to be a warrior, and I think masculinity to a certain extent might be tied to something like that. Like when you had the roles were very defined of like men went out and hunted and faced them like the dinosaurs, you know what I mean? Not the dinosaurs because that was before us, but we were out there fighting creatures in the wilderness, and there was no comforts. We're living in caves, and we had these defined gender roles. I think, from what I know, I mean, I wasn't there, so I think, it seems like that's how it was, from what we can tell. And so I don't know, maybe there's this like part of every male that draws in from that primal like DNA that says, I got to go kill something. I got to go hit something. I have to stand up and fight for somebody. I have to protect something. You know what I mean? And maybe it's different for every man, and that's why we have kind of different bends towards certain things, you know. It's like you may not have that urgency that I feel. It may not exist in you for that I got to go kill something, I got to go hurt something, I got to go break something. I feel that. But you may feel something else that's more like I got to stand up for this person. I have to protect these people. I have to voice my opinions here. You know what I mean? Like maybe that's written into your DNA code. That's your masculinity. You know, that's your connection with your primal roots. What do you think? I don't know. Have you ever considered that?
One thing that went through my mind as you were saying that is I don't think we can reduce the gender roles into dichotomies of maybe this is what it's like to manifest being masculine and this is feminine. I think there's a lot of overlap and a lot of bell curve there, which we need to look at with a certain amount of historicity. I mean, what we feel today is, I agree, probably a result of generations and generations of people who have been doing things before us. And so what do we do with that today? I would say then it would be the case that some of your perspectives, some of your desires are gifted to you, and you don't have the option of rejecting them. So you were born into a certain family, you were born with a certain ethnicity, you were born into a certain region with a certain history of ancestors. None of that was your option. And then there are certain aspects of who you are which you've adopted over the course of your life. And you could say that you adopted them only because of where you were born into, and maybe that is the truth, but I think there are maybe various portions of our identity that we have to come to terms with. One being, what did I inherit? What is it in me that I long for that I didn't ask to long for? I don't know why I'm interested in this. I just am. And maybe for some people it's more physical. Maybe for some people it's more expressive artistically. Or for some people it manifests as music. And you think, I don't know why this is in me, but it is, and I really want to pursue it. And then I think there's also another element that says, I want to quest. I don't think that's specifically a masculine feature. I think that women desire it to an extent too. Maybe if you look at the data, which I don't have because we just sort of sit down and started talking. So I feel like I'm going to say something now that I could Google and there will be some better answers for. But I think if you were to look at the data, the desire for quest and the desire for adventure, there's a lot of overlap between the genders. And there might be that a certain percentage of men and a certain percentage of women are more likely to do one thing or another. But I think to live a life that doesn't permit us the rite of passage to move from, and going back again to the topic of maturity, to move from this dependent to somebody who is their own man or their own woman, leaves us wondering, are we really capable of taking care of ourselves? And I think when you go out and work with your hands, when you go out and you hunt your own food, or maybe you garden, maybe you just go out in your backyard and you plant. My wife loves to plant things and grow them, things that we can buy down the store, like a mile away. We could go down there and buy them, and it's not that they cost so much that we have to grow them. It's that she experiences a great sense of satisfaction with the tactile expression of actually nurturing and bringing up these plants. So she can say, I did this. I mean, I planted this, I cared for it, and I brought it up. And that's something that buying it from Kroger doesn't provide for her. And I think that we want to be able to feel like I did this. And whether the I did this is rebuilding an engine or supplying your own food, literally bringing home the bacon, or whether maybe money is the I did this, saying, I provided this amount of money so that my family can live like this, or I don't know. I think that there is something in that which is integral to our sense that we are a staple in society as an adult. We're no longer that dependent. And I do think there probably is a difference between the desires of men and women. Where that lies exactly, I don't know, but I think they're kind of manifesting the same things. They want to be their authentic self in the context of community. Because you're not doing this in a vacuum, right? Mm-hmm. It isn't like you're going out and you're living as a hermit in the woods and you're hunting all your own food and you're cooking all your own stuff. And even the hermits in the woods occasionally send mail bombs back to the real world. I mean, you don't just go off in the woods and forget people. So we're living within that context, and a lot of whether we feel like we're living up to it is determined by the way people perceive us on the outside. And that's challenging because we have to balance. We can't say it doesn't matter what the culture thinks, but we can't say all that matters is what the culture thinks. So we need a balance of being able to say, how do I fit into my culture, and how also can internally I satisfy the sense that I am living authentically the way that I feel like is a healthy way for me to live.
Well, I hope you guys are enjoying the conversation that we're having here. If you like this podcast, if you like this episode, if you find this interesting at all, you can give us a like or a share over at the Facebook page, or facebook.com/Tamale Mafia. You can find the Tamale Mafia podcast on just about any platform that you prefer to listen to. And you can use that to subscribe and share it with your pals. So you can find it on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, just about anywhere you want to listen to something, you will find the Tamale Mafia podcast. Okay, guys, appreciate you listening. Now let's get back to the conversation after this brief tunage from bensound.com. Thanks, Bensound. You talk about culture and how we interact and how we fit into that culture. One of the things that I'm concerned about in my culture is the idea of toxic masculinity. And so I feel like that term is a little bit ill-defined and maybe left up to interpretation for some. to just decide what that is. And I think by a generic definition of my understanding, the toxic masculinity has to do with the mistreatment and abuse of women, for one, and it being kind of disregarded as, well, boys will be boys. That's just what boys do. We were even talking earlier, alluding kind of momentarily about the culture that we were raised in our youth, and how sex was seen, and sexuality even, and how there's a lot of pressure put on the girls to not be a temptation to the boys. You got to cover yourselves up.
Toxic femininity.
Yeah, because boys can't handle themselves, because that's what boys, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I was, even then, I didn't like it, because I thought, how is it their responsibility for me? Like, dude, can't you control yourself? Can't you control yourself? If you can't, that's a problem. That's a major problem.
Yeah.
If you say, well, she was dressed this way, I couldn't. What does she expect? She expected to not have that done to her, you moron. And so I even back then, I didn't like that culture, that ideology.
Yeah. Well, that also, to me, echoes this idea of what is the difference between what we think is normal for an immature human and what we think is normal for an adult. We don't allow minors to engage in sexual activity because we don't expect that they're intellectually full enough developed to make wise decisions on this. We don't allow children to get tattoos because we think this needs to be a decision made by somebody with full control of their mental capacity, fully developed mind, because these are big decisions. So I think when you see men being treated like, well, they can't help themselves, when women dress that way, well, then these are immature guys. These are guys that didn't learn affect regulation. They didn't learn what you might just call self-discipline. They never moved past the childhood phase of needing someone to stand over them to say, no, don't do that. Mm-hmm. We shouldn't need that as a mature adult. I should be able to control my actions and treat women with respect and not have to have some parental figure saying, no, it's not okay to, hit that person or call that person a name. We do expect that of children. And we give children a lot of leniency because of that. And when you see a child throwing a fit in a grocery store, it's much different than seeing an adult throw a fit. We would be really shocked to see an adult throw a fit in the grocery store. Because we know that child just isn't to the point yet where he's capable of handling reality. That's why he has supervision 24/7. And so I think, I think that's tied in. And as we talk about it, it keeps in my mind coming up that maybe toxic masculinity, if we take masculinity as an attribute of manhood, maybe toxic masculinity isn't really masculinity at all. It's almost like the absence of masculinity.
Yeah.
Like if you were really manifesting masculinity, you would not be taking these actions.
Right. You would be taking a role of protector and self-control and, those kind of things that would be the opposite of. I think, but part of my concern with the cultural idea of toxic masculinity is that there will be pushback against masculinity altogether, so that there's not a difference between what's masculine and what is toxic masculinity, but it's just manliness is just wrong, if whatever thing that makes you a man, I like the color blue. Well, you can't freaking like the color blue because that's masculinity and it's wrong. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like if it gets pushed beyond normal reason, which there's groups out there that always push beyond normal reason. So in some of those conversations that I've heard online and seen on Twitter and stuff, and I see, I think yesterday I read a headline that Cher, the music artist Cher, tweeted out that there needs to be legislation where women can control men's bodies. She was kind of, I think, trying to make a play on abortion laws or things like that,
Yeah.
So she was saying women we should have laws that where women should control men's bodies, where all men have to be circumcised.
Was this, I assume this was sort of made sarcastically to highlight what it feels like as a woman to feel like guys have the right to do that to you.
Yeah. I don't think she was being serious, like all men need to be circumcised. But then she went further and said, and should carry a documentation to prove it or have to show their penis to prove it, which is kind of funny. But, that's to me, obviously sarcastic. But there's this idea that if you push things into that realm of just way out there, the absence of masculinity will lead to a generation of men who probably feel 10 times more like they're missing something than I have. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
The more that gets pushed back, the more that masculinity gets pushed back, the it's not natural and it's not okay. You know what I mean? It's like there's a craving that I have for masculine things, and so there's to me that's natural. That's not unnatural. I didn't wake up and decide I want to be more masculine. It's just I have this craving in me that something is not complete.
Yeah.
And so I don't, not necessarily fear that, but it's just kind of sticks in me when, like, pokes me in the side whenever I hear people talk about toxic masculinity, and I go, what is that? What exactly are we talking about? Because if we're just talking about, rape culture and sexual assault and abuse and, workplace abuses and things like that, I'm totally on board. I'm on your team.
Yeah.
Let's get rid of all of that. But if we're talking about pushing back against young boys wanting to play with guns and wanting to, fight with their brothers, and if we're pushing back against that, I'm not on board with that.
Yeah. Well, maybe let's stick with the fight with your brothers. I don't know if I want to get into the young boys playing with guns.
Well, toy guns, like action figure guns, things like that, like war fighting and play fighting.
Yeah, physical interactions.
Things that I enjoyed when I was a kid with my brothers. So it's like, I don't know.
Well, I have noticed a sort of unique facet of the male development is that at a certain point, usually around your teen years, boys become noticeably less physical, right? When you're younger, you tend to wrestle more. Even then, even at those ages, I believe statistically, what I've read at least, boys are less physical even prior to teen years than girls are. But we do reach a place right as we're transitioning into adulthood where there is a combination of internal feelings and external pressures to sort of stop interacting physically. And I'm going to make a really weird correlation here, and if this doesn't work, I'm going to walk it back, hopefully. But when I think
we'll just edit it out.
When I think of like men's behavior in the workplace and men's behavior in public, and the struggles traditionally with men being abusive or being repressive to women, there's a correlation that came into my head of the struggles that the Catholic Church has had with priests who are supposed to be celibate getting in trouble with boys. Here you have these people that are supposed to be a pretty extreme way, that are understandably having trouble being the way that they have committed to be. That part, the fact that celibacy is hard shouldn't surprise any of us, right? Mm-hmm. But then, because there isn't an outlet for them to address this in a healthy way, it's manifesting in very toxic ways. It's manifesting in deceptive and hurtful ways towards the people that they're supposed to be protecting and helping. And the correlation that's coming to my mind there is, I think we see men not understanding how to be vulnerable, how to communicate, how to talk about weakness, and being raised in a culture where too tied to the idea of masculinity is this idea that you don't ask for help. and you deal with everything yourself, and you suck it up and you don't cry.
Oh, yeah.
And so what happens is you don't have men doing some of the healthy activities that women already are better at doing in a lot of cases, which is opening up more, being more external with our emotions. So you have men repressing these things and then manifesting them in very unhealthy ways. So when I hear you say, you know, I hope that we don't push masculinity off to the side and sort of villainize masculinity, I hope that we begin more to include in the concept of masculinity the ability for men to be vulnerable and to be weak and to say, I need help. Because I think it is a problem if the idea of masculinity excludes those things and focuses only on the self-sufficiency, the strength, you know, and the never needing help, I guess. Does that make sense?
It does. Yeah, and that really raises a really interesting point, because as you're saying that, I'm thinking, well, maybe the traditional idea of masculinity is just ill-defined. I mean, you and I have both sat here for the last 40 minutes trying to figure out what it is. And we're both men, you know, and we still don't really know how to say this is what it is. And so, yeah, I think if we could make vulnerability an acceptable part of masculinity and maturity, then that would, to me, that would open up a lot of like opportunity for people to say, okay, this is what this is, and I accept this, and this is good, you know, because you're right. I think we as men a lot of times have a hard time expressing ourselves and kind of, you know, like you said, suck it up, don't cry, you know, that kind of stuff, and which brings me to, I guess, do we kind of wrap this up, because we're not going to solve all of this in an hour, but
I think we should probably give a definition, some low-level definition
of masculinity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I think a definition is there in our concepts. And right, the definition will probably have to evolve, and you know, we want to use statements that are current to our culture, but when I say we should give a definition, I think we should give a definition of where we're at with it now. So if we came back a year from now, we might change our definition of it, even if the Oxford Dictionary definition hasn't changed at all. But what does it mean to you based on this conversation? What do you think? Here are some actions I am pursuing to try to recapture the sense in myself that I am positively masculine.
Yeah. Well, I mean, part of that I think has been driven by my time that I spend with my 12-year-old son in itself, you know, and letting that kind of help define what does he need from me. He needs me to teach him how to go fishing. You know, there's skills that he wants me to pass on to him, and not just in a sense of this is about fishing, but that I have to know how to fish before I can teach him how to fish, you know. And you said something in your text message to me the other day that was really profound to me about loving yourself, and how a lot of this kind of masculinity and vulnerability, this whole conversation wraps up around the ability to fully accept and love yourself. And that has been primary in my pursuit of me, is to try to learn how to love myself, because I've spent so much of my life really not loving myself or not liking myself at all. And so, again, to tie that together, he needs me to teach him that. You know, my dad didn't sit down and teach me how to love myself. It just wasn't part of any conversation we ever had, you know?
Well, he was learning. He probably, I mean, I wonder today if you were to ask him, I would guess that he probably is still on that journey and doesn't feel like he's there yet.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah. And so, you know, I wanted to learn how to love myself just for me, because I was, again, operating from a center of love is the only way we can love others. So you have to have love in order to give love. And if you don't love yourself, then you really can't love anybody else. It's just a superficial attempt. So the true core of love is learning how to love yourself. And what was that? That was the wall.
It's a child coming in.
Yeah.
These are open air rooms.
And so that is new to me. That's a new revelation to me, is that I have to teach him. I have to pass down to him these skills. And so it's based on this conversation and my trying to understand what all this means, is it's less about the manifestation of things, of working with your hands or being able to work with tools, and more about self-presence, like who you are and identity, and being able to stand on that and say, I know that this is who I am and I love myself. Mm-hmm. And then the ability to teach that to the next generation and pass that down, I think. And when you tie in vulnerability to that, it opens the conversation even more, because now I have an opportunity where I can sit down with him and say, look, I don't get all this. I don't really know, but you know, I'm going to do my best.
Yeah.
To be this guy, love myself and love you and teach you how to do that, you know?
Yeah. I'm a long way from the man that I think that I could be in my head. And there are many days where I'm disappointed by the man I conclude that I actually am. Mm-hmm. You know, and yet I think there's a beauty in that, in the recognition that I'm on that journey and I'm not there yet, that I hope I always retain. I don't know if I can ever say I made it.
Yeah.
So maybe masculinity, I would say, I love that definition, something in the realm of, you know, living out love in all of its aspects from the unique vantage point of being a male. I don't want to use man there because I'm not trying to distinguish between boys and men. I'm not trying to distinguish between age, but the gender of being male. Saying masculinity is, you know, just manifesting the aspects of love from a unique vantage point, which is the male vantage point.
Yeah.
And what that means in your situation will be different than mine.
Yeah. I like it.
Maybe. I don't know. I'll have to think about it.
Well, we can come back in a year, maybe less, and see how we feel about it then. But
maybe one of us will have changed genders by then, and we'll have a different perspective.
Well, yeah, carefully treading on the idea of gender as it is. We're only addressing two genders here in this conversation, and some would say that is in itself a flawed conversation.
I feel like we really only addressed one gender in this conversation, but
we did briefly discuss the feminine. Briefly, you mentioned the word like 3 times, I think. Yeah,
I got to bring the girls in there because I don't think that you can define masculinity apart from the presence of femininity. That it is the nature of the two distinctions that make each of them possible, right? Otherwise, we just say human. And I think to a certain extent, there are a lot of times I just want to say human because so many of the issues we're talking about for guys have an analog for women, right? It's not unique to guys in some regards. Maybe if anything, it's just that, we have different ways of processing them, but so much of this is just very human. There's a lot of overlap between the two. And we're very different men, you and I. You're a guy who wears a gun in his hip every day, and I'm a guy who's never owned a gun in my life, and who my wife thought at various points that maybe I was gay and wasn't telling her. Your dad was in the military, and my dad was, soft-spoken. I never saw him do anything violent, or so I feel like we have some interesting differences in our approach to the conversation.
Yeah, well, I think our differences have always been our strong point between us, because you challenge me to see things that really other people in my life don't challenge me towards, because they don't have your unique perspective on life, because our lives have been so different, yet in a lot of ways similar. So we've had similar experiences from different perspectives with different backgrounds.
Yeah.
And it's kind of brought us to this place where we can discuss difficult things, and I can walk away from it going, wow, okay, I never considered that before, but now that he said it, yeah, that's something to think about, whereas I think a lot of times discussing difficult topics with certain people just doesn't work. You know? I can't discuss difficult topics with my dad because the conversation wouldn't last very long, for one. And both sides would probably walk away going, that mother, So,
well, there is a way of approaching things in which there's the enemy and there's the allies, and then there is a way of approaching things where you can't tell who the enemy is. And I think there are advantages and disadvantages to both. And I think knowing your dad just as little as I do, and having spent time talking with him, I think that he likes to be able to approach a topic and clearly draw the line between who is on what side. Mm-hmm. And I grew up with people who did a lot of counseling, and even though they had some fairly black and white views, I still feel like I took away from them the idea of nuance. And having spent a lot of time researching psychology and stuff, I tend to look at situations and just don't see good guys and bad guys at all. Don't see people who are necessarily right and wrong. I just see a bunch of humans trying to figure stuff out and coming to different conclusions.
Yeah, and I get that from you all the time. That's one of the things I've learned from you, I think, in just in our conversations and hearing you talk to other people. I've learned to try to take that approach. It's very difficult for me with my background and how I was raised. It's very difficult for me to take that a gray area approach. But I try to, and I find myself a lot of times when I'm in conversations saying, okay, how would Brewster formulate his response here? What would he say? Or how, and it almost always is, what question would he ask? Because in this podcast, you have shared a lot of thought and opinion, but in an ordinary conversation with you, you're the one asking all the questions.
Yeah.
And
I tried not to make you talk the whole time.
Yeah. So, and I appreciate that. But that's what I've learned from you, I think, in dealing with other people, is like, how would you approach this, and what questions would you ask? And I try to formulate that in my head and then take that approach to a conversation, because sometimes, you're right. We're all people. We're all a bunch of humans trying to figure it out. And I don't think anybody has it quite there in any respect. But
yeah,
man, we've said it all. We've said plenty.
We solved the world's problems.
We did. We solved it. Toxic masculinity, it's all solved in this podcast.
So next time we're going to talk femininity?
Yeah, man. You want to really get me confused on something I don't know anything about? Let's talk about that. All right, man. Thanks.
Yes, sir. Love you.
Love you too.
Well, there you have it. We said it all. We said plenty. I don't know that we answered the questions properly or even began to scratch the surface of that topic, but
we did our very level best to fit as much as we could into 1 hour. And I'm sure we'll come back at a later date and continue that conversation, or other conversations, because I love having conversations with Mr. Brewster. So let me leave you with this. The very purpose of this conversation was because we have these questions in our minds that we battle with and we struggle with. And ultimately, it's not about finding the perfect answer, but it's about doing the things that you feel compelled to do to make you feel like you're becoming more whole and you're becoming a better person. And passing that information down to your offspring, to your next generation, wherever your influence is. All right, so press into it. Don't be afraid of it. And we'll catch you guys on Thursday. Peace out. The Tamale Mafia podcast is brought to you by me. The Tamale Mafia podcast is on Spotify, YouTube, iTunes, Podcast Addict, and a bunch of other places. For more information about the Tamale Mafia podcast, find us on Facebook at facebook.com/Tamale Mafia. Our intro music is brought to you by me. Our transition music is brought to you by bensound.com. For more royalty-free music, check out bensound.com. Our outro music is brought to you by Lim. For more mind-blowing intellectual electronic tracks, go to soundcloud.com/getlim. That's LIMN. And as always, thanks for listening.